Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about shoulder health and reducing your chances of injuring your shoulders in the weight room. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on scaling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. All right guys, this is going to be a bigger deal the older you get, and when you guys get to be my age, you're going to meet dozens of people through your life who are going to talk to you about how they used to train, they used to lift, but then they impinged their shoulder, or they damaged a rotator cuff, or they had this problem or that problem with their shoulders. Usually they'll blame it on the bench press, but we need to talk about basic things that you can do to dramatically reduce your chances of these things happening. Now, this is not to say that you will never get hurt, because like any other activity, you can get hurt weightlifting. You can get hurt weightlifting with perfect form. You can get hurt doing everything correctly, but what we're doing is dramatically reducing our chances. But if we're talking about that, you're talking about still less chance that you're going to get hurt than by getting in your car and driving down the street, because that's also a dangerous activity. But people don't think of that in the same risk factor. But I can tell you right now, if you lift every day versus drive a car every day, you are more likely to get injured driving a vehicle or being in a vehicle out on the roads than you are lifting weights if you do both safely and correctly, right? So it can happen, but it's pretty rare that it will if you're doing everything right. But I do want to make that clear, you're never going to remove all risk. Everything is technically dangerous that you do in life. So with weight training, a couple of things to think about is going to be little simple things like grip width, pushing versus pulling. Now, we could argue about rotator cuff exercises and face pulls and all that, and I generally have preached that face pulls are a good idea for the purposes of injury prevention, but that may not even be true. I've even heard apparently the barbell medicine guys are saying that, hey, the data is not actually there supporting that. So we'll throw that in as maybe just a good measure at the end, but I wouldn't necessarily put much stock in it. Biggest things though that people do is going to be their pushing and pulling exercises with a really wide grip. Really wide grips. Really wide grips are harder on your shoulders. So what I usually tell people is that when you're talking about your pull-ups, you're talking about your bench pressing, things like that, these really wide grips where you get out here wide. Yes, that I know you can bench more with this wider grip, right? But it's also harder on your shoulders. And oftentimes you find the guys who have a lot more longevity, say even in the sport of powerlifting, who don't have a lot of shoulder problems, they do bench with a narrower grip. This way you guys see me bench. I practice what I preach there because I believe it carries a little less risk. I believe it's easier on the shoulder joints, and because you're moving the weight through a longer range of motion, you have at least more potential for muscle growth. So I tend to promote this idea of shoulder width, shoulder width for bench pressing. So right about here, you can go a little narrower, but the whole point is that we're like this instead of way out here. Now, the other big deal is notice how far I come down. That's another big one. You need to keep the bar below the nipple line on the flat bench. Now, people will ask, well, what about incline? Well, it's going to be a little higher up, but you don't want to be benching up here to your clavicle, even on the incline. You want it to be lower, and the whole point is that we're trying to maintain a degree of elbow tuck at the bottom. You don't want the elbows flaring at the very bottom. It's not to say that you can't start flaring them once the weight is well on the way, because there are situations in which that can help move you past your sticking point. But you don't want to be flared at the bottom, and that is determined largely by bar path. If you just put the bar in a correct position, which is benching lower on the chest, that will go away, the risks of that. Furthermore, the narrower grip will again be easier on your shoulders. It's a lot easier all the way around. Now, when we start talking about things like pull-ups or even lat pull-downs, I guess, but I mean, lat pull-down, you're never going to have quite as much stress. Different exercise, I'm not really a big fan for the most part, but even those I would say narrow grip. In fact, I would say lat pull-downs as narrow as possible, right? The little V handles and stuff are great because, again, the longer range of motion involved if you're going for overall development. But people will tend to do their pull-ups oftentimes with a really wide grip. Look at that in terms of what's going on with the shoulder joint. It's harder on the shoulders. Now, of course, I'm going to say all this, and you've got guys like Kokloff, who does his Kokloff press behind the neck. But I'm going to say he's a bit of a genetic freak there, because I'm going to go with that in a minute, too, the whole behind the neck press thing. So pull-ups, and any sort of upper body pull like that. And I'm not talking about snatch, grip, deadlifts. I'm not talking about the snatch, any of that. I'm talking about when you're pulling actively, moving like this. That the really, really wide grip is harder on your shoulder joints. Now, does that mean if you do that for years and years and years, you're automatically going to get injured? No. It just puts more stress on the joint. It's more overall stress, and it's something over time could contribute to injuries. So all we're talking about here is just reducing your chances of injuries. Plus, when you start going to a narrower version, what happens? Your range of motion increases. And usually, if your goal is hypertrophy, not necessarily performance at any given point, you're not trying to demonstrate your strength, you're trying to build strength. And we build strength by building muscle, by building technique, things like that. A longer range of motion is usually more conducive for better overall muscle growth. And so what you find on both of these sort of exercises, whether we're talking about a bench press or we're talking about a pull-up or an overhead press or anything else, a narrower grip is going to have a longer range of motion. So we've got some better growth potential there. The other things to look at would be things like avoiding the behind the neck press. I like the behind the neck press. I know that from a muscle building perspective, the behind the neck press, you start looking at things like EMG activity, everything else is a fantastic exercise. The problem is not everyone can do it safely. It's considered to be counterindicated. There are people who are built to do it correctly. There are other people who their shoulder structure and everything just will not let them perform the exercise without a degree of risk. That's a very individual thing. And what I would say to most people, odds are for most of you it's probably not worth it. Now if you're going to be maybe a world level Olympic lifter, like again someone like Dmitry Koklov, that's a little bit different, isn't it? And he does really, really heavy behind the neck presses with an ultra wide grip with no shoulder injuries, but he's also kind of a genetic freak in and of himself. Another thing to talk about is going to be pushing versus pulling. Oftentimes when we become very interior dominant, which is the majority of us, it can increase the risk of shoulder injury. So what you need to be looking at is the total amount of pulling you're doing that involves the shoulder, which is again things like everything from pull-ups, lat pull-downs, rows, chin-ups, face pulls, all that stuff. Is it exceeding the amount of pushing you're doing? You need to make sure you're doing at least as much pulling as far as exercises that work the shoulder, entire shoulder structure, shoulder girdle, versus pushing. And your pushing could be all your benching, your dipping, your overhead pressing, anything that's going to work the interior deltoid. You want to make sure that you're getting a good balance there so that you don't become interior dominant. And it's a real good idea to pay attention to that early on in your training, because that can matter over time as far as just creating better muscle balance, better shoulder structure, stability as far as the shoulder structure goes, and muscle imbalances themselves can contribute to joint injuries. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the knee, whether we're talking about the shoulder, whether we're talking about the elbow. Having good balanced musculature around a joint to where the muscles are roughly evenly developed is a good idea overall for injury prevention. It's a good idea. It can be helpful over time. So those are things to look at. Then we need to look at other exercises, some of the stuff that's really dangerous that people do. How about upright rows? How about the way people do these side lateral raises? One of the biggest ones, and again, you always see bodybuilders say things like turn your pinky up, because you'll feel that burn. Well, that burn you're feeling is crushing the glenoid inside your shoulder joint. That's why you feel the burn doing it. It's not that your side delt is getting worked more, it's that there are internal structures of the shoulder that can be harmed by doing this over time. And so by doing that, you are causing damage, you're causing injuries. So if you're going to do side laterals, not that I'm a big fan, make sure that your thumb is higher than your pinky, because they'll always tell you the opposite. Oh, like you're pouring something out. Well, that is actually dangerous. That will actually injure the structures of your shoulder joint over time. And that might be what causes you to need a shoulder surgery later. And so I would say to people, there are other ways to work the delts than to do something that compromises the shoulder joint. So avoiding those. And if you're, like I said, if you're going to do side laterals, do them with the thumb up. Yeah, you might need to lean over a little more to get it to work where you think is the right spot, but that's okay. That's okay. It's better than hurting yourself. Upright rows, behind the neck presses, probably things that we need to be thinking about very seriously if we want to do those, if we want to maintain our shoulder health. Another big one, seated overhead presses. Why? Because people tend to lean back and it puts your shoulder into a compromised position. The worst one's when people do them in a Smith machine. that absolutely destroys your shoulders. Absolutely destroy your shoulders. Because if you look at the angle involved, you can't push through when you're doing this stuff. You need to, when you're locking out at the top, get the bar behind your head for any sort of overhead press. And when you're seated and you're pushing back against it, it doesn't tend to do that. You can put your shoulder in a more compromised position that causes impingement that could be avoided by doing them standing and pushing through using the correct bar path. So it's little things like that that add up over time. And if you follow all these little tips I just gave you, as far as maintaining a narrower grip on all these exercises, keeping your pulling equal to your pushing with exercises that involve the deltoid so that you balance the shoulder structure. You avoid counter-indicated exercises and movements, which mean overhead pressing done incorrectly, which is almost always going to happen when you're seated, avoiding behind the neck presses, doing side laterals incorrectly, upright rows. If you can do all those things and, again, keep your bench press bar path in the correct position, lower on the chest, and that counts for all chest presses, then the odds that your shoulders are going to have problems is going to drop down dramatically. You are very, very unlikely to have shoulder issues. You're gonna cut those chances down considerably. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.